Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Greg Hadley, who will be talking to us today about extensive reading in the second language classroom, a new view for encouraging avid reading. Greg Hadley is a professor of sociolinguistics and Western cultural studies at Niigata University, Japan. So over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Nicholas. Hi, everybody. Thanks for all of you that are getting up at different times of the day, early in the morning. Some of you are there late at night. Really appreciate you sharing your time with me at this time. And I hope that it'll be worth your while. But time is limited, so let's go ahead and start moving into our talk for today. So extensive reading, or ER, is an approach to teaching and learning in the second language where learners read large quantities of material that's within their range of language proficiencies. So the students will read small books that are called graded readers, and the focus is to encourage reading for pleasure in the second language. Teachers are to avoid explicitly teaching vocabulary or grammar, and testing is also discouraged. According to Day and Bamford, doing such things would rob the students of the joy of reading. There was a meta-analysis by Dow in 2014 of many years of different ER research projects, and he presented compelling evidence for ER's potential to foster better vocabulary learning, faster reading speeds, deeper language comprehension. And he also found that many of the studies reported that students would gain self-confidence as they could see that they were progressing in the language while they were also reading for enjoyment. But it seems that most of this research is based upon the study of students who have succeeded in ER courses, and there's been less research on what's been happening with those less successful learners who often drop out of the course midstream. And there's also, in my opinion, too much of a focus on ER in the classroom, and there's less attention on the reading processes and the history that the students bring to the classroom. Much of the research, which matches my interviews with ER teachers, also seems to find that getting students to actually read extensively continues to be a major challenge. Now, I work in the sociology of language teaching, and I became curious about what was happening with our students in these extensive reading classes. I got a grant from the Japanese government to conduct a grounded theory study on extensive reading. Now, we don't have time to go into the details of the grounded theory methodology, but just suffice to say that grounded theory is a qualitative or mixed methods methodology that begins with an open-ended exploration of issues as they are presented by people in the field. And then this is followed by a more focused investigation on the main issues that seem to be emerging in the interviews and the study. And then this leads to the development of an explanatory theory that can help people to gain a better understanding about what's going on in some area of human activity. Right now, my study is moving back and forth between this phase called focused investigation and theory construction. I still have a way to go, but I have some preliminary findings that I want to share with you today. Now, this theory has been developed so far from a core of about 28 informant interviews. The research methodologist John Cresswell has written that 20 to 60 interviews are usually sufficient. And in my personal conversations with him, he's lowered that to around 20 to 30 interviews as being enough for getting the main findings of a grounded theory study. But more than just interviews have gone into this study. There's been a lot of background scholarly reading and big data surveys of social media using qualitative data analysis software. So in this presentation, I'm going to present my grounded theory of extensive reading to you, but only in very broad brush strokes. I'm going to tell you about the social processes that have been constructed from this research. And because the time is limited, though, I won't have time to present interview excerpts and some of the other field data that I've been collecting. But after discussing the theory, I'll suggest some ways that you can use these new insights in your ER classes. So as we begin, I should say that for those of you who are unfamiliar with the grounded theory methodology, that I come from a school where grounded theories are primarily used to highlight human action, interaction, and social processes. So the findings of this methodology are more concerned with what people do rather than what they think or feel. But the study of course, outward actions eventually do lead some grounded theorists, such as myself, to explore the internal human emotional and thought processes. And you will see that in this talk. Now, in addition, there will be quite a few new theoretical terms that you won't find anywhere else. I've developed these for describing what seems to have been going on with the people that have participated in the study. And this is common in grounded theory studies. So sit back and enjoy and see if any of this speaks to you as a teacher, especially if you're a teacher of extensive reading, and I'll do my best to try to make it interesting. Okay, so the key social process that seems to run through the entire ER experience is that of avidization. Now, avidization is a word that I've developed for this study. It means the process by which a certain activity becomes meaningfully integrated within one's professional, social, or personal life. Now, with relation to extensive reading in the second language, avidization takes place when reading is no longer a task and when it becomes either a vital means for working towards someone's particular language, learning goals, or when it becomes a renewable source of personal enjoyment and fulfillment. Now, I've chosen to invent this term avidization to get around the more commonly used terms, such as reading motivation. And the reason why I've done this is because motivation has become so problematized. Often now, when mentioned in teaching circles, it can mean anything from intrinsic, an internally intrinsic desire to do something regardless of external rewards, to simply just getting the students to conform to our wishes. Now, within avidization, one can see where, say, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation operate, as well as the role of the ideal self. Avidization tends to contain all of these in their socially interactive contexts. Okay, so now let's look at ER avidization in greater detail. The three main processes that take place within the trajectory of ER avidization are those of infograzing, story hunting, and book mining. There's one more process that actually subverts avidization, and that's called data grinding. And let's look deeper. So first, infograzing is the process where a person simply reads to get by. And they're generally passive readers, meaning that they'll read something when it's presented to them, say an advertisement, a billboard, completing tasks in their daily lives. For example, cooking an instant dinner or following the instructions on how to purchase a train ticket at the machine, or reading the back of a cereal box briefly while eating. It might help to see this visual metaphor of infograzing as sitting inside a stasis, sort of floating around in, let's say, something like a huge seedless grape with a very, very thick skin. And there are many things that can work to keep a person solidly in the practice of infograzing. These are issues called time framing, status pressure, and neurological diversity. And let's look at these three very briefly. In terms of time framing, it's whether or not a person becomes avidized towards extensive reading depends largely upon if they view time as a limited resource or if they view time as a non-issue when it comes to reading. So depending on the degree of pressure that one is feeling with regard to this, this will either keep a person from reading or put them on a path towards avidization. Now, with neurological diversity, this refers to the ways that our brains are wired differently and how this affects how we read. Now, many teachers will know about dyslexia. In places like Japan, it's rarely diagnosed, but this can have an effect on whether or not a person will want to persevere in an extensive reading class. But in recent years, neurological research has studied a condition known as Aventasia. Aventasia is the inability to actually imagine pictures in your mind when you read or hear someone tell you a story. The opposite extreme of this is hyperphantasia, which is an imagination so vivid that it can almost be indistinguishable from reality. Now, all of us are somewhere along the climb between these two extremes, and while most of us are able to visualize, as many as 30% of people in our class have a much fuzzier mind's eye. And many as 10% of the students may not actually be seeing anything in their mind's eye when they're reading. So in extreme cases, this can keep a person from extensive reading, but in the lesser extreme cases, many of these can also push a person towards different avidization strategies, which we will look at shortly. Now, stasis pressure relates to the many other things in a person's life that may work against the urge to read. This can be an uncomfortable living environment or certain distracting emotional states. It may be the priorities in a person's life that leave little time for reading, or they just may find greater satisfaction in active hobbies and would be preferring, or they prefer to do these things rather than what they would see as just sitting around and reading a book. Okay, so these factors are part of the fabric of this thick membrane that pushes down on a person and keeps them floating around in this stasis of infograzing. But what moves a person towards avidization? Well, these are events that can happen in a person's life that can disrupt this stasis. These will pull them out of infograzing. And I call these the 3 Ps of passion, pain, and pressure. Let me explain these. Passion relates to those memorable positive experiences, such as a parent reading stories to you as a child when you were little, or of a mentor giving you a book during a very difficult time in your life, of experiencing a sense of wonder when you've walked into a huge library or a bookstore. Positive experiences with people and places where books or reading were part of the fabric of that moment. Pain refers to experiences of loss, such as a downward shift in life status, of being bullied or ostracized, of losing a loved one to death or separation or divorce, or experiencing abandonment, either as a child or later in life, experiencing domestic abuse or other forms of emotional turmoil. And pressure here is seen positively. It frames reading as something that one is just expected to do, and that these are things that we do, and meaningful people around them encourage that. Now, of course, it's usually a combination of these sorts of events that will pull a person out of infograzing. It might be a combination of pain and pressure, or passion, pain, and pressure. But it seems that in my research, there's usually one of these types of events that will be a little bit more prominent than the others. Now, of course, as an aside, you're going to say, well, how doesn't this just apply to reading in the first language? And this process of being pulled out of one's stability applies to avidization for many more things than just reading, I should say. But we're applying it specifically now to extensive reading. But we can look at the beginning of processes, for example, of how students become avid second language learners. You can look at their lives, and I think you can see some students who go through passion and wonder, experiences with people connected to the language, or others that have an inability to connect with others in their own language group, their own social group, and that learning a second language would be a way of moving away from that to find a new place, a new community. There will be others who see that learning a second language is just that's something that people do to get on in life and go forward in life. All of this will have a huge bearing on them just as second language learners. But research shows, in extensive reading research, that people who are avid readers in their first language will often become avid readers, avid extensive readers in the second language. And it's here that extensive reading intersects with what I'm discussing. Okay, so moving on, experiencing PPP, the pain, passion, pain, and pressure, places a person in a mental and emotional state for what I call reading maceration. Now, of course, you may be unfamiliar with the term maceration. Maceration is a stage in winemaking where grapes are in an environment for a necessary period of time. And I'm using the term metaphorically now for when a person, through pain, passion, or pressure, is altered enough to start to reach out and browse different books at their disposal. This can be a solitary experience, but it often happens within a group or a community that values reading. But slowly or quickly, the person begins reading this and that. They try out different genres. And then over time, with more exposure, a level of maturation is reached until one day the person experiences what I call the quickening. Now, this is an experience that all enthusiastic readers go through, though some may not remember it because it happened maybe when they were quite young. Others may have it later in life. It's a point when the reading has reached a critical mass. Something has been sparked or invigorated inside. It transforms them to wanting to read more. And that's why I've made this visual metaphor here of a place where there's lots of different holes and different entry points. The reason I did that is because everybody's different, and it's only through this process of maceration and maturation that a person connects with the type of reading materials that will spark their quickening in their mental space. This is one aspect of avidization that we can't control, but we can observe it when it happens. We hope that some students will have it in extensive reading classes, and you will know it when it happens, because when the quickening has happened, you'll see a certain student begin the process of reading much more intentionally, intensively, and silent reading much more extensively. So the quickening builds pressure in the reader for something more that leads to something that I call the hungering. Now, this is a stage in avidization where a person has a profound sense of emptiness when they're not reading. Some of it, people that I've interviewed describe it as an addiction, others as a deep ache. Some people describe this world as so dull, so painful, or so disappointing that they want to enter into another place. They long to slip out of this world and enter into the book world where they can find satisfaction and fulfillment. This hungering will take them on a path towards one form of avidization called story hunting. Now, story hunting is the process where most people would describe themselves as being an avid reader. They read for enjoyment and spiritual fulfillment. They're often connoisseurs of specific genres. They have emotional relationships with characters in a book and are often fans of certain authors. They tend to be more on the spectrum towards hyperfantasia, meaning that they often read as they are in varying degrees, like seeing a movie in their mind and experience a story as if they're there. And in terms of time, there's never a question of not having enough time to read. It's whether they'll have time to do other tasks instead. And they often identify, sometimes with a bit of pride, that they are an avid reader or that they like to read. But this form of avidization is not a constant, because people can become de-avidized. This can happen when significant people put pressure on them to do other things besides reading for pleasure. Sometimes it's an emotional trauma or a change in living conditions that can affect their story hunting. But it's when story hunters can reconnect with that first experience of feeling hungry for stories and of the enjoyment they had in that time in their lives that the hungering can be revived and re-avidized. But this is only one form of avidization. The quickening experience can lead others to something that I call the thirsting. Now, this is a thirst for knowledge, a thirst for attainment, a thirst for insight that leads to personal fulfillment. They thirst to become the person that they feel they should be, ideally. It demands satisfaction, this thirst, and this means that they read a lot. They search for valuable knowledge and insight, and this leads to the type of avidization known as book mining. Now, book mining, as the term implies, refers to extensive reading as a means of accomplishing or attaining something that's important in it's of personal value to them. It could be something to improve their qualifications, to find out knowledge, or to improve their insight into certain research. In terms of extensive reading, it usually relates to people reading in order to improve their English language skills. They're reading in order to get something else. It's the ladder by which they climb to higher levels. They thirst for something that's usually specific in their lives. Now, there is a tendency for people who are book miners to have greater levels of aphantasia, but not all aphantasics are book miners. But those who do have this condition will focus more on concepts rather than pictures when they read. They see this knowledge as being important to help them in their lives in a specific way. But because book miners tend to see time as a limited resource, they also use various strategies through technology to get through books. and other materials to extract the knowledge that they really want to get. So an interesting aspect of book mining is that those who do it rarely identify themselves as an avid reader. And they say this often with a sense of quiet shame, but they still read a lot, and they read voraciously when they're looking for answers or striving for goals. Now, de-avidization will take place when a book reader gets what they're looking for. When in extensive reading classes, they've improved enough, or they've gotten some other thing that they were striving for, the thirst is satisfied, and they will stop reading. Many ER classes have these systems where students are encouraged to read a lot, and this is measured through word counts, and they'll get credits through small quizzes on books that they've read and be awarded this. In my classes, you give a goal of 200,000 reading words in a semester. Now, students who use a book mining strategy will be capable of reaching and surpassing that goal. But once they do, or once the class is over, even though they state they would like to continue reading, they also admit that without the pressure or the goals of the class, they won't. They can be re-avidized, though, with a new goal or a new thirst for knowledge. Okay, so far we've seen how people can read avidly, and we should say, of course, that people will book mine sometimes when they thirst, story hunt other times when they're looking for new narratives, but others will stick primarily on one trajectory or the other. But there's another process that will take place when infograzers get outside pressure, but they have not been through a period of reading maceration. Especially for ER classes that are required for all learners, you're going to encounter learners where ER feels for them to be like a mental invasion, or perhaps they feel like they've been locked in a mental prison. They want the class credits so they can get on with their lives, but there has to be another way other than reading a lot of graded readers. So this unmacerated pressure of reading goals, targets for books to read, word reading amounts, and all the like in ER will lead these students into a state of bypass evasion. Now, ER is a burden. It threatens their peace of mind. Something has to be done to get ER out of their lives as soon as possible. And so this leads to the avoidance trajectory, which I have labeled as data grinding. Now, the thing with data grinding is that some of the strategies used by learners to get information quickly are similar to those of book miners. Reading the end of the story first, using the search function in a PDF to find the necessary information quickly. But then others are distinct, such as reading the book in the first language version first, and then reading the graded reader story, or watching the movie based on the story in the graded reader, or finding an online summary of the book in their native language, or asking their friends to tell them about graded readers that they have read so that they can try to pass the test or just try to get through. Now, they may do this because of negative second language or first language reading experiences, but some of the informants have told me that they had undiagnosed reading difficulties. But the main difference between a data grinder and a book miner is that book miners thirst to know and they want to improve, but data grinders want to get the reading materials out of their mental spaces as quickly as possible. So this is why in this visual representation, you can see the trajectory breaking up. As soon as the bits of information and whatever forms of things that they need to give to to their authorities to satisfy them has been done, they immediately return to infograzing and whatever forms of satisfaction that they can get from through status pressure. Okay, so that's the theory in a nutshell. And it's important to note again that a book miner or a story hunter can resort to data grinding when they have to do something that doesn't interest or inspire them. For example, maybe reading tax forms or something of that nature. Right, so infograzing, story hunting, book mining, and data grinding. The social processes in this grounded theory of ER avidization. And there's a lot more going on here in this theory, but we just don't have time to go into great detail. But the trajectory from infograzing to either story hunting or book mining, if it's macerated and then maturated, as well as to data grinding if unmacerated, are the major features of avidization in extensive reading. And my study suggests that our studies bring these practices from the first language into the ER classroom. And these can either support or subvert their response to second language extensive reading. Okay, so you're beginning to wonder, all right, so what can I do with this? I'm busy and I got a class coming up, so cut to the chase. Okay, so I think that there are some important takeaways that we can get from this grounded theory. So with the new terminology of this theory, you now have ways of identifying what's already been going on in your class. If you can name it, you can see it. It heightens our awareness that students have a relationship and a history with reading before they come to our classes in extensive reading. You can know this, and you can work with what they bring to the class. For the students coming to your classes, we'll be able to identify whether they're prone to infograzing or book mining or story hunting. We can do this by asking them questions about their first language reading experiences. You know, do they like to read? Do they find some deeper purpose in reading? Or maybe, no, if not, maybe the student might be into infograzing. If the student likes reading, in what way? Do they want to accomplish a goal? Do they have a personal language goal? They might be inclined towards book mining. The student loves to read and that's what they like to do, might be a story hunter. Knowing this will help you to move them further along in ER avidization. So an infograzer might be in your class because it was required, because they needed to get a credit in the class. It was the only time in their schedule to get this credit. So getting an infograzer moving on means to develop relationships with them and have them develop relationships with other students in the class. This can be done through caring and sharing activities. It can be done through other activities that will help them to find those portals of interest and put them on a path towards one form of avidization or another. And you know, basically, ER programs attempt to act as a reading maceration chamber. So more exposure means more possibility that some will become quickened, and then to decide whether they want to book mine or hunt stories. So you have to help them find strategies for making good use of their time. Students who are story hunters and book miners can be informants during activities where they can share their strategies for how they read and how they read extensively. So moving students away from infograzing towards story hunting or book mining requires individual attention, since what quickens each student will be unique to each. So when you find students in the act of data grinding, though, if possible, try to lessen the pressure. See if you can find what inspires them and ignites their passions for something better. If they're hurt or ostracized, well, maybe you can engage them, encourage them to read something that might speak to them. But treat ER with them as something that every second language learner just does, and that it's a matter of fact sort of thing. Now, students who frequently use a book mining strategy need clear goals, reading targets, and measures such as regular speed reading tests, something to track them. But it's important not to go over the top and to encourage them to go too far with this, because it's the striving for these goals that's what's driving them to read more. So having word reading goals means that book miners will be tempted to try and choose the more difficult books in order to get to those higher word counts more quickly. But don't let them do this if you can, because of course they won't be able to read as much. And if they do find shortcuts to these goals, they will quickly become de-avidized. So essentially, structure and gentle pressure will keep them reading, but don't be disappointed if they stop immediately once the class is over. Now, ironically, the strategies of structure and assessment, and measurement have the opposite effect on story hunters. They are particular about the genre and the types of things they want to read. They know what they want, and they don't need much help getting there. So a better strategy is to encourage story hunters to share their experiences of reading and their thoughts on what they have read to infograzers and book miners. And this can at times lead to further quickening, thirsting, and hunting. Okay, so as we look to the future, this theory brings up some critical considerations. I mean, for example, online platforms like mReader and XReading tend to work very well with book mining, but how can they be adjusted to foster story hunting? I mean, or should we encourage students to switch strategies? If you have a student who is fixated on goals and reads a lot, but is less prone to story hunting, should you encourage them to try to read for pleasure? Or what about a student who reads for pleasure, but is only reading actually quite little, and there's no evidence of improving? Should you try to get them to move more towards book mining, or to chart their vocabulary or their reading speeds? There's no easy answer to these questions, but because it may be that some students will become de-avidized. But it's not that students always do one or the other. At sometimes, some students may be prone to do one process when engaged in extensive reading. But still, these are things that some of these issues that I see raised with graded readers. The vast majority of the graded readers, I should say, seem to fit mostly for story hunters. And I think that we need more readers on self-improvement, biographies, and factual content, which would appeal to book miners. Most of the educational experience outside of the ERA class favors book mining. And so I wonder how we can foster more of a sense of community among students who do read in our classes. And finally, with language education, with our emphasis on metrics, goals, and other things related to structure, this also tends to drive us to focus on the technical aspects of getting students to read. And I'm wondering, as a result of my study, if we need to redefine student success in ways that might lead away from just simple measurement. There's much more that I could share, but we're just about out of time. So I'd like to thank you for your patience in listening. And at this point, I'll stop and ask if any of you have any questions for the remainder of this session. Nicholas.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was a fantastic talk. You condensed, I mean, almost a whole lecture series of information quite brilliantly into this small session. And the comments in the chat all echoed the same point, that they wish they had you for longer. This subject was so engaging. So in the chat, if you could please join me by giving a virtual clap for Greg here. That was really enjoyable.
Thank you.
Greg, I'm going to synthesize a couple of questions from Shane, from Santa Marinulus. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing that correctly. And they're sort of talking about how with this younger generation, who are sort of more wired to their phones and social media, that have these lower attention spans, how do we get past that first hurdle of inspiring that passion for reading?
Well, there's not one clear answer for this, but gosh, I think I just lost. Oh, here we are. I thought for a second we lost my screen there. I thought, oh, here we are. You have to find, you can't, there's not one strategy you're going to be able to use. You need to find, first of all, what interests a particular student, and provide them with paper graded readers. I think that, yes, there are a lot of graded readers now that are being provided online. And I love technology. I use technology a lot. So don't get me wrong on this. But the reading on a screen, reading on small screens and other screens, especially when you're connected to the internet, is not conducive to extensive reading, to reading. And in fact, a lot of the news articles or other things that you read online are basically a stasis for commercials. So just as you're getting into reading, there are commercials and things moving around, like I'm moving around on the screen, and you can't read. And this is what it affects the person's reading, their ways of reading. So this, again, it sounds really old school, but you need to get them away from their screens. Have those times in the class with sustained silent reading, where the students are there with books, with graded readers, if you can get them from some of the publishers and such, and have them sit for 30, 45 minutes, if you can, just reading. And the teacher can be reading there with them and walking around, and have if you, depending on the period of time, you may have less time or more time, and have time of students to talk to each other about what they're reading and what they're thinking about. That's, there's no magic bullet for this. But if you can give them, let them have enough access to graded readers where they can actually check these out of a library and carry them along with them. Students who are avid readers and successful extensive readers, they will carry these books with them so that if they're, and you can tell the students that, you know, when you've got about 10 minutes in between classes, or you're on a train or a bus, and instead of looking at your phone, take some time and read these books in the time, the spaces in between. The more they do that, that will help, because there's no distractions on the paper, in the paper book. There's no pop-ups that'll say, hey, what about this? You know, or hey, have you checked your email yet? You know, so that's what I would suggest from what I've been learning from my study. Again, it's not magic.
Yeah, I have to agree. It's very hard to give one concrete answer for this very complex issue. I also find that parents, they recognize the importance of reading, and they want their children to be readers, but often the times they don't set, they don't offer the environment at home. They're saying, kids, you should read, and they're simultaneously on their phones, checking and playing with their phones. So I like the point that you raised, that you've got to give the environment as well. I guess that would also be appropriate for parents. Watching your presentation, I was intrigued, trying to figure out, what type of reader am I, or which one do I tend to fall into myself. I could see sometimes I might be a data miner. Sometimes I'm more looking for the stories. And we've got a question here. It says, is there some test where, we can identify what students, or is it just more like what you mentioned, that, we're sort of observing and asking the students?
Yeah, there is no test at this time. I'm still in the process of developing this theory, and I hope eventually it'll become a book. And part of that book will be for me to develop a test that you can have at the end of the book, where you can give a survey or a questionnaire to students about their preferences, which would help you to assess whether or not they're leaning towards one strategy or another. But you could do this yourself. I mean, watch this. I think this will be on YouTube. You can watch and listen to some of the things that I'm talking about. You could make your own, or you could just talk with the students. Depends on how many students you have, how close you are with them. If you speak their language, some people may be teaching in second language environments where the teacher is a native speaker of one language. The students are. It depends. But if you can, if you can engage the students personally, and ask them, that's fine. If their students are kind of afraid of you or shy or something, then you could create your own questionnaire. I'm going to do it eventually, but it's not there yet.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. Saram had a question, and it sort of links with what you were mentioning at the end. In reading classes, Sarah mentions that he's supposed to submit graded readers only, and he has to assess it and include it in his exams. How does he do that in an ideal way? Is there any metric? And you also mentioned that, maybe this way is not the best way to assess learners. Could you spend a moment maybe expanding upon that?
Yeah, so the person has to give a grade based on graded readers. Okay. Yeah, I know, I'm in that situation too. And what I do is I have the students read their books. They'll go online to a site called mReader, which is a free site that they can join up with that. And these have quizzes, different quizzes that are based on most of the graded readers. Find out the students have the graded readers that the quizzes. There's a lot of them up there, and then after the student reads a book, then he or she can go online and take this quiz, and there's an account for that student. If the student passes the quiz, then the number of words that are in that book will be credited to their account. So you could say, oh, this class, you need to read 50,000 words to pass the class, or something of that. You can decide whatever amount. That's what I do. Now, for those of you who aren't connected or have really tenuous connections to the internet, then at the back of each book, of a lot of graded readers will tell you how many words are actually contained within the book. And the student can write this down. Then that would be a case of you having also read the book. And you can talk to the student briefly and ask, what do you think about this in this book? Or what happened there? This, and get a quick rough and ready thing. Okay, yeah, the student wrote the book and they got so many amounts of words there, and you can check it off or something. And they, got a paper record. You don't have to be electronic on that. But trying to, give them lots of vocabulary tests and other things of that nature, grammar tests connected to that. That's iffy. I've done some research on this, and the students can improve in terms of their vocabulary and grammar, but usually not statistically significant. But their reading speeds, if you have them go through an extensive, their reading speeds do improve. And I've got enough research on that where it is, you can certainly see a statistical improvement in that, but not enough.
Am I right in saying, from what I've read, that learning in a foreign language, that learners who read more and become more proficient in reading actually become better at their general production in the target language?
Over time, yes, over time. It's use that term again, is a long, you need a period of maceration and maturation, but it does, reap benefits later on. But if you're going to do a semester or a year, well, after a year you'll certainly see some things. But if you got just like a semester with them, then what you're doing is you're paying forward for something else, because you're not the only teacher they're going to encounter. And hopefully they'll encounter more opportunities to read in the second language as they continue to go on. But yeah, here in Japan, all of the people who are proficient, really proficient speakers of English, all of them they read a lot in English, and they like reading.
Yes, quite right. All right, guys, lots of fantastic questions for you guys in the chat. Wish we had more time with Greg, but unfortunately, we've come quite close to the end. So if you could join me in giving Greg a big clap, a digital clap in the chat box, would be much appreciated. You can see a lot more of Greg online. He's done previous talks for us, so please look him up on Cambridge ELT YouTube channel. And I'm sure you can find other talks from Greg online as well. I know for one, I found that fascinating and very helpful. And I'm sure all the other teachers who took time to listen also found that quite enjoyable.